So welcome everyone to Next Economy Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're meeting us for the first time, welcome. The Center for Social Innovation is a community, co-working space, and launchpad for entrepreneurs, organizations, and companies that are changing the world by putting people and planet first. Across our 3 locations in Toronto, there are about 1,000 social purpose organizations that call CSI their work home. In these times, we are a vibrant online community, and we continue to offer daily opportunities for our members to virtually gather, learn, and collaborate together, including community events, education programs, and acceleration programs. The Center for Social Innovation Institute is our affiliate charity and event partner, and they help Canadians use social innovation to get to the root causes of systems level problems. Our title sponsor for Next Economy Conversations is Fix. Fix is the first open computerized maintenance system platform that mixes innovative technology with a focus on partnering with customers to help them organize assets, manage work, connect to business systems, and make data-driven decisions. More than 2,600 companies in over 90 countries trust Fix to help evaluate, buy, and implement maintenance software and simplify their journey to modern maintenance. At CSI, we always start our events with an acknowledgement of the land, even if they're virtual events. So this afternoon, we want to acknowledge that for those of us who are in Toronto, we're gathering on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. As we think and talk about social innovation, we are sometimes discussing a shared vision for a sustainable and just future. However, it's critical that we also reflect on the past and the present to consider how we can strive towards more inclusive, resilient communities that incorporate and respect many different ways of knowing and being. And as we move our work and our lives into the digital realm, this also means considering how patterns of inequality can transcend into these spaces. So on that note, we want to share this quote from Alexander Dirksen on decolonizing digital spaces. Meaningful change begins with recognition of technological innovation as a fundamentally human endeavor. Behind the sleek glass and metal enclosures of our lithium-charged lifelines are people, with each line of code carrying with it all the complexities of human existence. Technology is not a neutral force, nor are digital spaces safe spaces for all, instead mirroring, replicating, and at times exacerbating the real and pressing realities faced by Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities in physical spaces. A social justice lens must therefore be applied to all that we discuss, design, and develop in the digital realm. So we encourage you to consider what it might look like in your own work to apply a social justice lens, whether you're also hosting emergent conversations or if you're participating in them and shaping them. And you can also look at this resource called Native Land to learn more about the land that you're on. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our guest for this month, Paul Taylor, the Executive Director of FoodShare. FoodShare advocates for food justice by supporting community-based initiatives through ongoing advocacy and public education. Their vision is a city where all people can feed themselves, their loved ones, and their communities with dignity and joy. From urban farms to affordable produce markets to community kitchens, every year they reach over 260,000 people across Toronto. Paul Taylor is a lifelong anti-poverty activist, having worked both here and in Vancouver. Paul has used his personal experiences to fuel a career focused not just on helping others, but also dismantling the beliefs and systems that lead to poverty and food insecurity, including colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. In 2020, Paul was named one of Canada's top 40 under 40 and Toronto Life's 50 most influential Torontonians of the year. Paul will be in conversation today with our Director of Programs at the Center for Social Innovation, Barnaby Geis. Barnaby designs and runs programs that grow startups and organizations with a focus on a social and environmental purpose. He leads CSI's Climate Ventures, an incubator, co-working space, and a range of national accelerators that support entrepreneurs and innovators working on climate solutions. And he has raised millions in funding for climate action programs. So Barnaby, I'm going to hand it over to you to share what we mean by the next economy and get the conversation started.
Awesome. Thank you, Zoya, our audience for joining us, and Paul for being our guest. So yeah, before this started, Zoya suggested to me that I start with a quick overview of what is the next economy, which I admit that I found a bit more challenging than I thought, because when you Google the next economy or the new economy, you get different definitions, and many focus mostly on technology and innovation. So to me, it refers to a shift from an economy that is often and historically largely being founded on exploitation and extraction. It refers to a shift from unfettered capitalism and the policies most associated with neoliberalism, such as deregulation, privatization, globalization, and generally the supremacy of the private sector and its profits, towards a mixed economy that works for people and the planet. And in a way, we may find it easier to agree on what it's not than what it is. There will be much debate about what it should be, about the role of the private sector versus the state, what kinds of policies and regulations will be needed, ownership models, guarantees and protections, taxes and investments, and so on. At CSI, as Zoya mentioned, we say the next economy will be regenerative, equitable, and prosperous for all. And not just prosperous in terms of material prosperity and financial wealth, but especially in terms of belonging, community, health, happiness, and access. At its core, though, I think the word next really serves as an invitation to imagine, to co-create, to push, to shape, and to participate. And the exciting thing is the next economy is already emerging with inspiring examples here at CSI, in Toronto, across Canada, and around the world, showing us what it can look like in action. The next economy is sustainable, it's people-centered, it's circular, just, participatory, and equitable. It is conscious and caring, and it builds community wealth, health, and well-being. And as COVID has also made abundantly clear, it is necessary, it's urgent, and even in purely economic terms, it makes sense. It leads to short-term economic growth, jobs, long-term savings, and resilience. And this event series is our chance to hear from the leaders who are actually on the ground helping to build and shape this next economy. So I am thrilled to get to interview you, Paul, today. Paul, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
How are you doing these days? How have you been navigating these truly complex and challenging times?
Well, even that's a big question. But even before I answer that, there's something that I'd like to do. I'd also like to acknowledge the land that I'm on, which is the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm really grateful to be able to be here today. It's also important for me, and I think for all of us, to acknowledge the folks that are here as a result of slavery. In this case, the transatlantic slave trade. I often reflect on the interconnections of, when I think about FoodShare's work, Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation, especially when I consider the historical context of the modern industrial food system. So it's a system that for us, we recognize is predicated on stolen land and that was farmed by stolen people. So, I recognize, you ask how I'm doing, I recognize that I can only do the work that I do and fight for the things that I fight for if I'm also making sure that I'm resting my mind and my body, so I could say I'm mostly doing well. And I think that the part that's really doing well is based on, my commitment to prioritize taking care of myself as best as I can. I try to model that also for my colleagues, but also ensuring that we're creating space and time for my colleagues to do the same.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before we get into your work at FoodShare, I'd love to hear about your journey into this space. What led you to work in the food justice space, and what drives you? Especially these days, what makes you jump out of bed in the morning?
Well, to be honest, I do the work that I do primarily because I've personally experienced, the horrific consequences of thoughtless government cutbacks or ho-hum policy incrementalism. And I think the lack of ambition of many of our politicians when it comes to tackling some of the issues that are really near and dear to me, poverty, food insecurity, homelessness. I'm pretty grounded in why I'm doing this work, and some specific experiences that reinforce for me or that have inspired me to do the work that I do. I'll never forget, being 13 years old. I tell this story often. When former Premier Mike Harris cut welfare by 22%, that had a huge impact on low-income families relying on welfare right across the province, including my own. And, I think that's one thing to say, it's one thing to have that kind of policy. But I even remember, talking to my mother at the time when I heard about, the Minister of Social Services at the time, a fellow named David Tabushi. He was on the news and he talked about how it was possible for people to eat on what he called the welfare diet, and went on to even describe it and said that it was, like eating pasta without sauce and buying reduced priced dented tins from local grocery stores. It was a policy, it was public policy rooted in cruelty inflicted upon those that are materially poor. So I do this work because I know what it's like to also be told that what I deserve are other people's leftovers or dented tins or corporate cast-offs. I truly believe that low-income people are not walking compost bins for multinational corporations or anyone for that matter. Low-income people deserve, I think, community organizations and politicians willing to fight alongside them. So although I may not be poor or food insecure anymore, I'm going to fight alongside those that are until things change.
That's a powerful way of saying that, and we'll explore that a lot more. Just going back a bit to your personal journey, when I read about your bio, I saw that you studied political science, public administration, governance at York University, I believe, and then you were a teacher, I think, at a private school before kind of making it seems, a big shift in your career and going to work at a homeless youth shelter in Scarborough. I'd love to just kind of get a sense of that journey for you and what prompted that change.
Yeah, I guess I would say, anybody that knows me knows that I'm pretty passionate about most of the things that I do and get involved with. And I was a passionate educator. Many of my students still reach out to me and talk to me about the experiences in the classroom. But to be frank, I didn't want my labor and my passion for education and for pedagogy, directed to, I think young people who already have access to the best of everything, children coming from some of the most affluent homes in the city. I wanted my labor to support the folks who society consistently neglects, who society consistently passes over, and systematically has made more vulnerable. And I actually, when I say that, I make no mistake, these folks aren't vulnerable. They've been made vulnerable to a whole host of things. We see it right now in the context of the pandemic. Who's been made most vulnerable to COVID-19 and its effects?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it seems that at that point, that really was the career path that you embarked on. I read that you went to Vancouver. You worked in neighborhood housing initially in the downtown east side. And then I'm just wondering how these organizations kind of shaped your perspective, especially in your current work around, food charity as a response to poverty. What lessons did you learn and take back here when you came back to Toronto?
Question. I think the first thing I learned was that we all have a right to food. I never learned that in school. I never learned that from listening to politicians speak on the news. No one ever talked about the fact that in Canada we have a right to food, and that our government has a legal and moral duty to create the conditions to make it possible for everyone to be able to feed themselves, their families, and their communities, and that we've had this right since 1976 as part of our economic, cultural, and social rights. So I really enjoyed the time that I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver, a community often referred to as Canada's poorest postal code, and while the folks might be materially poor, I found that there was so much brilliance, creativity, and innovation in the work that we did together. So I was really inspired by pushing back on the default response in this country that is, when it comes to hunger, that's often food banking or these food waste diversion schemes. And we were collectively, alongside low-income, street-involved folks, survival sex workers, we were critical of this kind of the role of charity. So I learned also, we were able to build a big coalition, including, like I say, all of those folks who typically are often positioned to be outside looking in on decision making. So having folks most affected by poor policy decisions guide decision making, I think, was key. And I also think another thing I took away from that was, did a lot of learning about organizing and how we create structures, including nonprofit organizations, that often work really well for middle-class folks. Everything from the 9-to-5 schedule to, the governance setup and the distribution of minutes via email, working with people that were street involved and creating an organization alongside folks that were street involved that worked for them, was mind-blowing to me. I learned so much more about things like where we post minutes, in local spaces in the community, because people have been made homeless. And then some of our outreach activities, involved walking through the back alleys of the downtown east side with shopping carts filled with bananas to have conversations with bananas, because, if you have poor teeth and you can eat a banana, but we used it as a mechanism to meet people exactly where they were hanging out or where they were living, to have conversations about what they wanted to see and how they wanted to be involved in building a neighborhood house in the downtown east side. So lessons are lessons that, I will take with me for the rest of my life.
You talked about food, not being spoken of or taught as a fundamental right. And I happened to be speaking to a young farmer yesterday who's kind of describing the farming space, and it was kind of heartbreaking. I mean, basically, from what he was saying, farmers aren't able to turn a profit. The average age of farmers is 63. It's basically impossible for younger people to get into farming. And then we know obviously the necessity of food and the power of food to bring people together. And I'm just wondering, I mean, we treat our planet like this, the air we breathe, the water we drink, but do you have thoughts on where this disconnect comes with this fundamental part of our life and the way that it's treated and kind of, not prioritized in a way in terms of accessibility or production?
Well, so much of what we've been taught about our food system, about farming, and about who farms is kind of hocus pocus. We have been taught that farming is done by old MacDonald with his straw hat and his cisgendered heteronormative family huddled around him. But so much of what we eat, I talked about how our food system, our modern industrial food system, has been built on stolen land and stolen bodies. Well, that type of oppression and racialization in our food system continues to this day. We have, whether it's the treatment of migrant agricultural workers who are so underrepresented, we never see them on boxes of whatever it is that are being sold in stores when they're trying to, design a product that connects people to the farming experience. So I think there's so much that we've been taught by, large multinational corporations about farming that has affected how we think about food and our food system. And so much of it is hogwash.
Yeah, and out of sight for so many people when we
Indeed.
speak of migrant workers and the just, absolute exploitation that they endure in Canada. It's horrifying.
Actually, and I'll just add one other piece, speaking of migrant agricultural workers, it's so jarring. I remember going to a farmer's market when I lived in Vancouver. I lived there for a period of time, as has been mentioned. And I remember going to this farmer's market, and it was on a street in the middle of the road, and there were tents covering each stand, these big tents. And, in the space where people were walking, and when you look at all of the different stands, farm stands, you saw white folks selling produce. And then when you walk on the other side of the street, you see black and brown folks who are doing the prep, who are not seen, who are not protected by the tent, preparing the produce that's then being sold to predominantly white folks at the farmers market. So it's just horrific, and so much of it we haven't challenged in ways that we really need to.
Yeah. And so it's probably a good time to talk about FoodShare and the work that you do through FoodShare and the community-based initiatives and interventions that you and your staff and community are doing. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, and before I do, I want to acknowledge that FoodShare has essential workers that are out distributing produce right now in the middle of the pandemic. They're helping distribute our emergency good food box, which I'll talk about, and our good food box. But these are folks, that I'm thinking about pretty often. When I get up in the morning, I'm thinking about making sure that we're doing everything to keep them safe. And before I go to bed, I'm often thinking the same thing. So really just deeply appreciative of the work that they're doing, and really feel pleased that we've been able to do more than treat them as essential in name only. But, FoodShare, what do we do? We work alongside communities that I think have been chronically underinvested in. And what we do is we work with those communities to build vibrant community-led food infrastructure. So everything from, turning a hydro corridor into an urban farm in the Flemington Park community, to transitioning a school field into a 2-acre urban farm and community produce market at Burnham Thorpe Collegiate in kind of Etobicoke, to supporting over 50 communities across the city to develop what we call good food markets. So they are subsidized produce markets that look a lot like farmers markets, but instead we prioritize access to folks that have had barriers to access to food foisted upon them. A couple other things that we do. I don't have an elevator pitch for our work, and I've been at FoodShare for almost 4 years. I think I never will, so I'll try and only mention a few more. We also lend our capacity and our experience to supporting BIPOC-led, BIPOC-serving organizations supporting folks in equity-seeking groups, equity-deserving groups that have joined our supportive partnership platform. So it's a platform where we help those groups working to challenge food access and equities in their communities. And then, of course, we have, I think what a lot of folks know us for is our good food box. Mine is set to, today's Thursday, so mine is set to be here anytime. So we may hear the doorbell ring. It's a box of produce that folks can purchase that shows up at their home, packed with beautiful fresh produce. And also, we've got an emergency good food box, which is the exact same thing as the good food box, but it's something that's being provided to folks who are struggling as a result of the pandemic right now.
And you've certainly touched about this through your kind of work experience and the discussion we've already had. But for our audience, can you kind of define food insecurity and talk a bit more about the factors that contribute to it?
That's a critical question, actually, because I think not enough people know. Our governments don't help in making it clear at all. Food insecurity is not hunger, and we should never use them interchangeably. Hunger is something that happens to an individual, and it may or may not be caused by food insecurity. Food insecurity is measured on the household level, and it means not having enough money to buy the food that the household needs. So in this country, there are over 5 million people that live in food insecure households. It's absolutely a crisis here. There are no other words to describe it. And to put it into context, the number of people living in food insecure households in this country is equal to the combined populations of Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. And that's very likely an underestimate. StatsCan administers the Canadian Community Health Survey, which is where we get the data on food insecurity in this country, and it doesn't capture folks that are homeless or Indigenous folks living on reserve.
Right. And you touched on the economic aspect, the inequality. What's the role of food deserts as well, even just being able to access food, even if you had the money to access it? I've learned a little bit about that in Toronto, and it's certainly, I think, something that a lot of people ignore.
I kind of actually push back on the idea of food deserts because there's some data that suggests, and my experience also suggests that, when folks are low income, they will travel great distances to access the food that they need. I know for my family, we were collecting coupons and we were walking from place to place to buy things. So it was, less dependent on what was immediately close to us. And often, this idea, my friend Karen Washington in the Bronx, she also challenges the idea of food deserts, because a desert seems like it's naturally occurring, but instead I like the language that she uses and calls it a food apartheid. Mm-hmm. Another thing around food deserts that I've started to say is that often there's a part of that conversation that's neglected, and it's, I think, food mirages. For me, there were places, whether it was where I lived or where I went to school, that had beautiful fresh produce that I could see, but after a while I stopped seeing it because we couldn't afford it. So I think, that kind of concept of a food desert really requires some deep interrogation.
Thank you. And I think related to this, FoodShare in 2019 partnered with the University of Toronto to research the correlation between race and food security using the Canadian Community Health Survey data. So wondering what prompted that research, though I can guess it's critical to the work that you're doing, but mostly what did you find out, and perhaps what surprised you the most in those findings?
First thing we found out that surprised us had little to do with the research that we did. The first thing that stunned us was that there was a startling and appalling lack of research that looked at food insecurity in Black Canadians. So we wanted to get a better sense of what was happening and get a sense of the scope of the issue. So through this partnership with Proof, we learned a lot. And I think much of what we learned really challenged some widespread beliefs about food insecurity in this country. What we did is we analyzed the Canadian Community Health Survey from 2005 to 2014, and we found that to be a Black person in this country means that you are 3.5 times more likely to live in a food insecure household than if you're a white person. We found that 12% of white children live in food insecure households versus 36% of Black children. When I say what we learned challenged some of our understanding collectively around food insecurity, it's about some of these pieces. So things like household composition. We had, when we look aggregately at the data around food insecurity, we know that if someone is living in a lone parent household, they're more likely to be food insecure. Well, for Black households, it didn't matter if it was a single parent household or a dual parent household, the prevalence remained high. The same was true for immigration status. It didn't matter if a Black person was born in Canada, born abroad, how long they had been here. A couple other really startling pieces was around home ownership. Home ownership, as we had understood, which makes sense. If somebody owns a home, they're less likely to be food insecure. But what we actually found was that 14% of white renters are food insecure, which is almost equivalent to the 14 and change percent of Black homeowners that are food insecure. A couple other things I just want to share on this research because it was pretty important. The other things we found, we looked at where people get their money from. We know the bulk of people that are food insecure receive their income from work, but there's also a percentage paid work, but there's also a percentage that receive it from social assistance. We noticed a variance. We noticed that white folks were receiving more money on social assistance in Canada than Black folks were. And we couldn't understand why. We thought welfare, you punch in some numbers and then this is the entitlement. But when we recognized that, disability income supports were included in those calculations, it led us to believe that white folks are more likely to be approved for disability. And when they are approved, they're more likely to be approved for more. And sorry, the one last thing I'll say about this research is that we also understood that when someone becomes a senior, as soon as someone hits retirement age, their risk to food insecurity decreases very significantly. And that's because they have access to a basic income of sorts, the old age security, guaranteed income supplement. So many of us in the food space have been saying, we don't need another pilot. We know that a basic income has an impact on food insecurity levels. We see it with seniors. For Black seniors in this country, it didn't matter. The risk remained high, regardless of hitting retirement age. So all that to say, it's nothing other than anti-Black racism that's causing that data. Systems that cause Black people to be more likely food insecure than white people. It's that simple.
And sorry, I just missed the last part. Why was that still the case at retirement? With the benefits provided?
Yeah, so at retirement, it had to do, we just saw the data, but we can make some assumptions, that maybe it is that Black folks haven't had the same income level that white folks have had. So by the time we become seniors, we haven't saved as much, we haven't contributed as much to CPP. So those figures are less. That's one of the big takeaways for us.
Yeah, a wealth of information. And not surprising in a sense because of anti-Blackness and white supremacy being embedded in the systems of our economy and our society. So I'm interested to talk about how this data informed your work at FoodShare, but also we know that we need systems change to tackle these horrendous issues in the way they're affecting people and to build a next economy. So maybe we'll start kind of big and talk about the policy changes that you think need to happen to tackle some of this and to make sure this is something we can address.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm asked that from time to time, and I'm less interested in prescribing specific policy as I am a framework. Right now what we're seeing are significant human rights violations, whether it's the right to food, the right to housing, a whole bunch of rights that are being violated, the right to safety. So I would like to see our governments prioritize advancing a human rights agenda and using a human rights framework for developing policies that tackle a whole bunch of things: anti-Black racism, food insecurity, racialized food insecurity, poverty. And I think then through that lens, we'll start to have conversations about things like, an income floor. We'll start to have conversations about the provision of significant amounts of non-market housing. We'll start to have conversations about pharmacare. So looking at, in essence, in terms of food insecurity, all the things that people are spending their money on that are pretty fixed, that detract from their ability to buy food. But it has to be framed, I believe, within a human rights framework.
Yeah, that's a great point. And right now with government, there's a growing conversation with a certain sense of urgency that's happening specifically around the recovery to COVID-19 and to addressing the climate crisis. Do you feel encouraged that some of what we've been speaking about is finding its way? Certainly when you look at a Green New Deal framework, that there's not consensus necessarily on what that looks like, but it's trying to address this intersectionality of social environmental challenges, and wondering if you feel that there's a hope there for us to make change quickly, or that we'll kind of fall back on just prioritizing clean tech and those kinds of sectors.
I'm excited about conversations like the conversations that are being had about a Green New Deal, because they reflect exactly what I'm talking about, prioritizing human rights, looking at the interconnected ways that these issues are playing out as a result of colonialism, capitalism, all of those pieces. So I am a huge proponent of a Green New Deal. Where I see some concern is, our government has identified that they've put aside $100 billion that's going to be used for economic stimulus. And there are no details. We don't know what that's going to, we'll probably hear before an election, but we don't know at this point. But historically, what we've seen is those funds support what the government often calls shovel-ready projects. And, a bunch of jobs get created, but those jobs typically go to men. Those jobs typically aren't permanent. So I think we've got to have a people-centered approach to recovery that looks at things like, and it has an intersectional lens like a Green New Deal has the potential to, but looks at things like the need for a childcare, universal, accessible childcare program in this country. We know that a care work is green work. So, there are a number of things that we could be doing and we could be thinking about, but I'm not hearing this government kind of make those kinds of linkages, particularly around the economic opportunity presented by stimulus funding. And yes, the need to develop childcare, but also how that should be part of a just transition and supporting workers to transition to the jobs of the future.
Yeah. I want to go back to FoodShare, but this feels like a good time also to bring up your political work, and wondering if this was a result of seeing getting involved in politics as a lever to try to manifest this kind of change, and whether you see this as an important area for people to try to get into office and make this change happen from within.
I think people have to think long and hard about whether or not it's for them. I've had many running for office. I've had many conversations with Indigenous folks that understandably would never want to co-sign a colonial structure that has caused so much destruction. So, and I think, in lots of ways, politics is still steeped in patriarchy, white supremacy, and again, colonialism, anti-Black racism. So I think people have to think long and hard. My journey I was a poor kid. I ended up at Charities trying to figure out how I could make life better for people that were poor and food insecure, and ultimately recognized that charities were not the solution for that work. Charities are doing great work across the country. They're not tackling food insecurity or poverty. So that's what inspired me to say, what is going on? Why aren't our politicians recognizing that they are the ones, I think they do recognize this, but they are the ones that have the capacity to do the type of research that should be happening on an ongoing basis, particularly around communities that have been made more vulnerable, and then develop policy to challenge some of those issues. I keep saying this, but I'm not interested in politicians coming to food banks or food charities to sort tins or whatever it is they do and take photos. It's time to actually put down the tins and sort policy. That's what I'm interested in doing. That's what I'm interested in having our politicians do. And we need to get on with it, especially when it comes to challenges like the climate crisis before us.
Yeah, 100% agree. So maybe just to go back to the research and the data that you got, and how this informed the direction of your work and of FoodShare.
Yeah, so in a number of ways. Where do I start? It, for us, reinforced a commitment to tackling anti-Black racism as a part of our work to address food insecurity. But we also recognized that, when it comes to there's a significant problem when it comes to charities, especially the most well-resourced ones. We don't see the folks who are most affected by the issues that we're working on, poverty and food insecurity, leading the solution finding. We don't see it in charity. We don't see it around government decision-making tables. I remember when Doug Ford's first cabinet was announced, there were more people named Lisa in this cabinet than there were BIPOC folks. So we are not at the table. So our experience isn't reflected in the solutions that get proposed. So at FoodShare, while we have lots to do, we've done some work to identify and understand the ways in which our processes were reinforcing anti-Black racism and things like white supremacy. So it's changed how we hire and who we reach out to when we hire, how we screen resumes, and introduced an anonymized application process. I get a number of people reaching out to me saying, I've applied for this position. And I say, great, good luck. It's not much I can do. It's anonymized, someone whose function is to anonymize the resumes. We've done things like de-emphasizing paid accreditations. We know that university isn't accessible to us all in the same way. We don't negotiate pay because we know some men are more likely to have their pay increased as a result of those negotiations than women.
Right.
We take our cue in many ways and our guidance and collaboration from an Indigenous advisory circle that we work with, and a 60-member advisory committee where we prioritize racialized folks. We provide honorariums. We pay for meals, transportation, and childcare to be able to attend those meetings. And then lastly, I'll say we've also looked at how we compensate people. So we took a look at our pay grid, and we recognized to apply an anti-racist lens to how we pay people means recognizing that in our food system, it's Black and brown folks that are often the lowest paid. And I think our food charities and our charities across this country are no different. So what we did is we started with a 25% increase to folks at the bottom of the pay grid, with no increase to folks at the top of the pay grid. And then recently introduced a 4% increase plus some funds to support people through the pandemic and the transitions that they needed to make. But also, something that I'm really proud of is that we also introduced a lowest paid to highest paid ratio, something you never hear charities talking about, and you certainly don't hear multinational corporations talking about. But if we are all in this together, and if we are valuing our labor collectively, and if we are challenging income inequality, both internally and externally, we need to do things like this. So the highest paid worker at FoodShare can make no more than 3.7 times what the lowest paid worker at FoodShare makes. So there's a whole host of things that we've done. I could go on for a long time, but I think what we've done most importantly is we've made it a priority to try our best to do the work that we see that needs to happen in society as well as in our own organization.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds incredible. And I think we could talk about all that for an hour. And I'm sure there's a lot of people from the nonprofit and charitable sector in the audience. So just wondering, and for myself too, have you open sourced this at all? Or is there a place that people can learn more about the policies you've implemented as a way for other people to learn?
At this point, I think it's listening to sessions like this. We are still stumbling through in lots of ways. Some things are working. Some things, we're having to retool. So I don't think we're yet quite in a place to say, here is the gold standard around, what folks could be doing. But there are some things that folks can find that outline some of these pieces. If you Google FoodShare and our Combating Anti-Black Racism plan, you'll see online that we have posted a plan of all of the things that we're going to do that includes, and some of which that we've already moved on in big ways, but that includes looking at work conditions and a whole host of things. And I think folks might find that helpful. The key thing to doing that is we also included who's responsible for these things, what the deadline is, and then also accountability. So what happens if one of our colleagues feels like we're not doing as much as we commit to, or we're not working to the deadlines? What's the process? So I think all those things are important, and it took a long time, and it didn't begin this last summer. It started a year and a half before that. So it's about making resources available to do this work and taking the time to learn it.
Great, thank you. And I can see that somebody shared the link in the chat already.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask two quick questions and then open it up to the audience, because I know there's probably so many questions for you. One, and I know this could also be its own hour, so we can just cover it quickly, but just wondering about your opinion around Canada's, well, at least from my perspective, completely outdated charitable law, and how that impacts the work that charities can do, especially in the food space.
Well, I think that's one of our big challenges. For us, as you may have gleaned, we're not afraid to bite any hands, even the hands that think they're feeding us. And I think it's only a matter of time before the government finds ways to come for us. So I think the important thing is that we know that our community will be right beside us. Yes, the laws are antiquated. I think they come from 16th century, whatever it is, they're antiquated, and they prevent organizations from actively being able to advocate alongside the folks that they're working with. And these are folks who our systems have made vulnerable, who have had all kinds of barriers to advocacy placed on them. And the organizations that are closest to them also have a structural barrier imposed. So nonsense, more hogwash.
Well said. I like hogwash. I might start incorporating that into my own vocabulary. My last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, is just around maybe the biggest challenge that you're kind of facing right now in your work. And then the second part to that question is kind of what's giving you optimism these days.
I would say the big challenge, like I said, is that we are talking real talk. We're trying our best to walk the walk and talk the talk, and not be afraid to say to our funders, hey, what you're doing is wrong in some way, or pushing our funders to think about the way that they fund. So that comes with all kinds of challenges. We have, when we introduce the Dismantling White Supremacy Good Food Box, a good food box packed with produce grown locally by BIPOC growers, farms owned and led by BIPOC folks. We had a whole bunch of pushback, a lot of angry, predominantly a lot of white folks getting in touch and saying that, the word is too harsh and we shouldn't be. And you know what? We need to have those kinds of conversations, and we're not afraid to say, if FoodShare is not the organization that you should support, well, then FoodShare is not the organization that you should support. And thank you. So that does present some challenges because it means that sometimes folks pull their money away, but we're okay with that.
Yeah. And the last part of that question, the optimism.
Yes, let me end with some optimism. I think there is a growing movement of people that recognize the urgency of the food insecurity crisis. And most importantly, I think they recognize that we're not going to solve any of this with, dented tins of salty soup, day-old bread, or a bag of unsold Starbucks muffins. I think I'm so excited by the kind of elevated conversation that has been pushed in all kinds of spaces, including in food bank spaces that are also starting to come to the table and saying, you know what, we can't do this forever. We need meaningful government policy. So that gives me a bit of optimism.
Great. Paul, thank you so much. This has been such a powerful and insightful conversation. I've learned so much and will keep doing so with everything that I've gleaned from today. And we'll open it up to Tara and Zoya, as I'm sure there are many questions in the chat.
There was so much awesome activity in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you so much, Paul. You're, as always, insightful. And so we'll just jump right into some of the questions.
Okay, I'll try my best.
So one of them was around the legislation that's needed to address food waste and food security, and how these issues may or may not be connected.
They're not connected. We can't tell low-income people that what they deserve is food waste. I think we need to deal with food waste. Don't get me wrong. This is having a significant impact on climate. It's one of the major things we can do. But I think it's very dangerous, I think, to couple that conversation with one about food insecurity. We have more than enough food in this country to feed everyone that lives in this country. So it's about income. And I worry, since the 1980s, charity and food banking has occupied so much of what we think the solution is to poor policy, in essence. So I worry that, this is, food banking meets tech sometimes with some of the food waste diversion schemes that are popping up. Those are important, but they're not going to solve food insecurity. We need income and we need sound public policy to do that.
Thank you for speaking to that. There was also a question around, for those who cannot volunteer in person right now or afford to donate, how can we support FoodShare and support food security from home?
You don't need to do anything in person. Well, when you can do things in person, you can march down to your MP's office, your MPP's office. But if you have access to email, what you can do is you can send them an email, you can call them and say, why in this country do we have 5 million people that are food insecure? This is in one of the richest countries in the world. This is unacceptable. And you let them know that you won't tolerate it. That's what you can do to help us. We really try not to rely heavily on volunteer labor. So while we appreciate the kindness that people often are wanting to display, really what we want to do is we want to challenge these systems once and for all, and we need your help. So let's all, after this, if we can do one thing, let's contact our MPs, our MPPs, and tell them that food insecurity, poverty, homelessness, these are priorities.
Well said, thank you. There was also a question about how FoodShare partners with different community organizations also working on food and food justice. I know that the MLT work with dozens of other organizations. So what has that looked like and what's come from that?
For sure. So many great organizations or grassroots groups that are also recognizing and getting pissed off about the things that we're pissed off about, and recognize that the pandemic has, caused often, an inability to connect in the same way with the folks that they were working with. So what we've been able to do is, when we were first hearing that food banks were having to close at the onset of the pandemic, I remember thinking about, we've got all these trucks going around the city delivering food to people that are buying food as part of our social enterprise, a Good Food Box. So we said, let's just raise some money and let's partner with groups that are struggling with being able to connect with the folks that they typically work with. And they tell us where to send the food. So we partnered with almost 90 90 organizations or groups across the city, primarily working with BIPOC folks or other folks from equity deserving communities. And they would send us lists of the folks that they work with, no long forms, no tell us how much you make or personal information, just tell us which buzzer or where to leave the box. And we did, and we were able to, partner with organizations working with folks that are undocumented, survival sex workers, a whole host. We partnered with Foodora workers once they were fired by Foodora or Delivery Hero when they left this country. We partnered with Not Another Black Life to provide good food boxes to folks that needed to self-isolate after attending the Justice for Regis March. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And there's another question of, can you share more about what's happening with migrant agricultural workers in Canada, current policies and context, and then bust some myths for us and what should happen?
Yeah, so I think there are folks who can do a far better job than I. There are folks that I've listened to really carefully. I would encourage folks to check out organizations like the Migrant Workers Alliance, like Justicia. There are groups who are doing phenomenal work that we've been able to partner with and learn from. But I've heard some horrible stories, especially in the context of the pandemic. Certainly horrible stories about before. I guess, the first thing to recognize is in this country, when we bring in migrant agricultural workers, they are shackled to a single employer. Who do we do that to? There's a whole host of issues that around the seasonal agricultural worker program, but who do we shackle to a single employer? This is modern slavery. So in the context of the pandemic, we have Black and brown folks working in places where they aren't provided with adequate PPE, where they aren't supported in being able to physically distance. There was a time where the premier was saying to them, if you get sick, still go to work, all of these sorts of things, we need to be challenging. So what I would do is I would encourage you to look at what, organizations like the ones I referenced are doing, because they're speaking directly with migrant agricultural workers and have been helping to amplify the demands that these folks have recommended. Thanks for folks who are typing it into the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And we'll follow up as well with some resources also for more learning.
Great.
Are there initiatives to support Black farmers who are working to address food security? And how do we support BIPOC leaders and social enterprises that may help build the next economy and address food security through their work and business?
Ooh, big question. I guess I'm going to answer it really simply. Hopefully I don't leave the person asking the question wanting, but maybe I do, and they'll look even further. But, I'll just say that I've been inspired by, the longtime work of groups like African Food Basket, the Black Creek Community Farm in the Jane and Finch community, the work of Sundance Harvest, Zawadi Farms. I think while, they may be under-resourced and not celebrated in the way that they deserve, going back to Anon and African Food Basket, they've been doing this work and highlighting the need for Black food sovereignty for a really long time. So again, I encourage you to check out the work of all of these groups. And someone's saying support FoodShare. Yeah, sure. Thank you. We appreciate that too. But don't send us angry emails about the dismantling white supremacy box, because you might not like the response.
And we only have a few minutes left, so maybe I will wrap it up with one more question. There were
Okay.
lots of kind words and lots of insight that people have drawn from your leadership this time. And so our last question for you is, what has it meant to you to lead during such a challenging time, and what have you learned about leadership?
I can't tell you how profound it feels, growing up as someone that struggled with access to food and living in a household where we all interacted with the shame that we bestow on families that are materially poor. I hid how poor I was, how hungry we were sometimes. So it's such an incredible opportunity to be able to lead an organization like FoodShare, working with the amazing team that I do. So while that feels great, I learned a long time ago, it's only lonely at the top if you don't bring other people with you. So I think it's really important that it's not about me and the leadership, that the opportunity that I have, but it's about how do we make sure that other Black, Indigenous, racialized leaders, women, queer folk, how do we make sure that the folks who have been historically excluded are sitting at that table and driving and leading and having the opportunity, like myself, to be paid and resourced to do the work that I'm so deeply passionate about?
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you so much, Paul. That was fantastic, and you did an amazing job of answering all those different questions. um, and is there anything that we didn't ask you that you wanted to be asked? Is there anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
I just want to again acknowledge my colleagues that are out when many of us are at home, that are out delivering produce, the Good Food Box. These are folks that I mentioned that we've supported them beyond just in name only as essential workers. We have, from the moment the pandemic hit, we increased their pay by $4 an hour, and that has been consistent ever since the pandemic hit. So we do appreciate people's contributions. We appreciate people purchasing the Good Food Box if they live in Toronto, because it supports our work. And I feel really grateful that my colleagues are doing what they're doing, and I think we all should be really grateful that my colleagues and food service workers, food system workers, often low-wage food system workers, are out doing dangerous work so that we can have food to eat.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reminder. And on that note, we will follow up with some more information about FoodShare and the work that you do, ways to get involved. There were lots of great resources that were also shared in the chat. So we'll make sure that our attendees know how to follow up and engage with you afterwards.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, Zoya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.